Alright, so I don't really know where I left off. It's been a while since I put a video up, partially because I was just taking a break from working on stuff because everything was running and driving and took some time off. Last time I drove the truck, I realized I was having an issue with the transmission, like locking up and doing some weird stuff. It was running perfect for like a couple days, and then it started to progressively seem like it'd get a little bit worse, almost like the transbrake was binding. And I would start to accelerate in first gear, and then it would kind of like bind. If I could get it to go into second gear, then it would drive fine. So I started digging into that, trying to figure out what that issue is. Long story short, I might have found some stuff, and I might just be an idiot. I did make a tuning change to see if it would correct the issue, because I could see on a data log one of the times that it did start to bind, it wasn't meeting the mile per hour parameter. So I did change the mile per hour and the throttle position and pedal position correlation to where the throttle position and mile per hour would both be met by the time it would want to shift, just based on how this vehicle works. It's a little bit looser converter than a stock converter, so you're going to have a little bit higher throttle position and lower mile an hour, so I made some adjustments there. Seemed like it fixed it. I couldn't replicate it for a while, and I actually made a video while I was driving telling you guys that I think I fixed it. And I hope it was just a tuning issue. So I was all happy, but there was an issue with the recording on the video, so I went back out to go drive around, just around the block again to make the same video, and it locked up harder than it ever has before, like complete stop. It would be like 6 to 8 miles an hour, and it would just lock completely. It was actually squealing the tires. I would start to accelerate, and it would just completely dead stop lock it. Worse than it had been. So got it back home. I just decided I was going to pull the pan off and see if I could find anything. I did notice that there was a lot of fluid around, like it was leaking from the pan really bad. I did reuse the gasket when I did it. So kind of listening to some feedback and suggestions from the last video, I did a few things. So the last thing that I did before this issue started was I hooked up the transbrake signal wire to the reverse lights. So when I put it in reverse, it would back up. I unhooked all that wiring just to kind of undo the last things I did, to like work backwards and try to figure out if it was something that I did that caused it. Unhooked it, didn't fix it, still had the same issue. And then it got to a point where if I would activate the transbrake and I would rev to like 3,000 RPM and let the transbrake go, the truck wouldn't move at all. It would stay locked until I lifted, and then it would move forward. So again, thinking transbrake issue, I wanted to eliminate stuff, so I put it into manual low, and then I foot braked it, and it did the exact same thing with no transbrake. I lifted off the foot brake, and it wouldn't roll forward. Tried it in D3, same thing, no transbrake. Foot braked it up to 3,000, lift off the foot brake, and it would just sit there and not move until I lifted off the throttle, and then it would move forward. So at that point, I knew there was an issue, and it's either got to come back out or drop the pan, whatever. So I came back home and I dropped the pan. I did find one issue with the wiring, that the solder joint that came with it, the heat shrink ended up like expanding and then sliding down the heat shrink. So there was an exposed solder joint on the positive lead for the transbrake solenoids. So I'm gonna have to fix that. I'll have to pull the harness out of the side of the case, and what I'm gonna do with both of those solder joints, I'm gonna use like a long piece of heat shrink and just line that whole thing so it can't slide around. I don't feel like that was making the transbrake activate, but it definitely wasn't good that there was a positive lead open solder joint just floating in the pan. Then I did pull the reverse servo out because I wanted to see if maybe there was a cross leak, like maybe the seal was leaking. Because when I'm foot braking it, I'm thinking maybe there's a cross leak and it's pushing pressure into the reverse servo. So while you're in low gear, first gear, it's leaking fluid into the servo and activating the rear band, the reverse band. And then when you lift off the throttle, the pressure lowers and then it goes back to normal. No issues with that. Everything looked good. I also tested the travel on the servo. I did test it on the installation to make sure that it had the correct amount of travel. I did it underneath. I just kind of used the floor jack and then jacked it up to make sure that I had the right travel. That was all good. One of the suggestions, or one of the things that a couple people said in the last video when I was having issues, was that they had a similar issue when they ran the speed sensor wire and their crank signal together, that it was basically trying to command fourth gear because crank signal was giving it speed signal, and thought it was freaked out. So when I did the installation, I did wrap the transbrake wire. I basically ran it right with the speed sensor wire that's sending a signal back to the stock ECU for the integration. So that's another option, that it is picking up signal from the speed sensor wiring and lightly activating the trans brake and making it drag, or it's getting the right amount of signal that it just pulses it for a second. So I'm gonna undo all that wiring, redo all of it, run it in a separate location, make sure that that's all good, fix the solder joint, heat shrink that stuff, because the transmission works perfect. Like when it's cold, everything is fine, and when it gets up to temp, it starts to act up. So that's what makes me think it's a cross leak or something like that. I did email Jake at Jake's Performance today, so I'll wait for a response there. But now I'm kind of feeling like I should have investigated a little more before I emailed them. So I usually don't like to ask questions unless I'm like really stumped, and I just decided to ask before completely getting to a point where I was lost. So I went underneath today, and just for shits, I decided I was gonna check the valve body bolts, and I put the wrench on one and I tightened it, and I got about a quarter turn out of the bolt. So I checked another bolt, and same thing. I got another quarter turn out of the bolt. So I basically went through every single one of the valve body bolts, and I got about a quarter turn out of it to where I felt it was comfortably tight by hand. So when I installed this transmission, or when I rebuilt it, I bought a new torque wrench to build the transmission with, because I wanted this to be like a decent, it's like a nice transmission, and I wanted everything to be decent. So I'm like, I'm gonna use a torque wrench. So I bought a new torque wrench, and maybe it didn't work. I did notice that there was a lot of fluid around, like it was leaking from the pan really bad. So I thought it was tight, or maybe there was some settling with the gaskets or something, but all of the bolts are definitely loose on the valve body. So I got about a quarter to a third of a turn out of every single bolt on it. All right, so there is the solder joint. So this was actually pushed up in between the body and the case a little bit up higher. But you can see that the heat shrink is like loose, and that just came off the wiring, so gotta fix that. But look at this bolt. This isn't even like, this one was probably one of the worst ones, so I wanted to show this one. But I basically just, with one hand, could take the wrench like this, and but I basically just, with one hand like this, and I could actually turn some of the bolts. So that's disappointing. All right, so yeah, obviously I'm not really too thrilled about that, but I do like to show my mistakes. It's definitely an issue either way. So whether that fixes it or not, I have no idea. I don't know if like the seals or like the gasket will be blown out in a section. I'm not gonna drop it. I'm gonna put the pan back on, and I'll drive it and see if it does it again. But that would make sense why it was giving almost like a cross leak symptom if the fucking valve body was loose. So, and that one that I just had the little wrench on, that's right by the manual valve. So those two bolts are holding the detent for the shifter selector, and the manual valve is right there, and that's what selects which direction the fluid goes for the gears. So if there's a cross leak right there at that valve, which is determining where the fluid is going to go, it could easily apply another gear. So hopefully that was it, because that would be a really simple fix. I just feel like an idiot, but that's kind of what we do here, is feel like an idiot and share being an idiot. Thanks for watching. Have a good one, and hopefully we'll have some good news in the next one.